Jonathan Boyd. Jonathan is the Executive Director of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, which is, I think, Europe's leading institution looking at and researching socio-demographic study of the Jewish populations of Europe and particularly the United Kingdom. And therefore very important in helping to shape policy and communal response to issues that affect the Jewish world. Jonathan is joining us this evening because on Sunday, we are all going to, by law, have to fill in the UK census, those of us who live in England or Wales, at least, not in Scotland. And so we thought it would be interesting to hear from Jonathan about why the census is important, particularly to the Jewish community. So Jonathan's going to speak for half an hour or so and do a PowerPoint presentation, and then we'll have the opportunity for some questions afterwards. As ever with questions on Zoom, we have to do them in a slightly different way. So I'm going to ask that if you have a question, you send it to me in the chat. So when you go to the chat, you have to make sure that you choose me as the co-host and send it to me. And then what I'm going to do is, depending on time, either I'll ask your questions for you, or we'll be able to sort of go around to people and give you the opportunity to ask your questions for yourselves. We will, as ever with these Thursday evening things, be done by 8 o'clock. That is our commitment. So we'll have a tight hour, which means you don't really want to hear from me anymore. And I'm delighted to hand over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Josh. Lovely to be here. Lovely to see a few familiar faces. Yeah, as Josh says, I'm Jonathan Boyd. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research. I'm here to talk about a big moment in data collection in the UK, which of course is the 2021 census. I'm going to share my screen and then we'll kick off. Hold on 1 second. Let me just figure out how to do this. There we go. Okay, everyone see that? Great. Let me just start with some really basic stuff. I figure everyone knows this, but I will start simple. What's the national census? First of all, it's the largest and most extensive social research exercise that takes place in the UK. It happens every 10 years, always in the year ending in 1. And it's compulsory, as Josh said, for every household in the country to complete by law. There are actually 3 separate operations. There's one in England and Wales conducted by the Office for National Statistics. That's the one that everyone here will be involved with, I assume. There's one in Scotland, there's one in Northern Ireland. This year, for the first time, I believe, the one in Scotland has been delayed a year because of the pandemic. They've pushed it back to next year. So, but the ones in England and Wales and Northern Ireland are happening on Sunday. And essentially the census asks every household in the country to record details of who lives in their household or who lives in that property on a very specific day. This year it's the 21st of March. And the data that it generates is used in all sorts of ways for planning and resource allocation at all levels of government, health, education. It's used by civil society organizations, it's used by businesses. And it's really sort of the key data gathering exercise that takes place. And there's a particular Jewish interest in it, and there has been since 2001, which was when a religion question was introduced for the first time with a Jewish tick box. And what I want to really talk about today is what that has generated for the Jewish community and a little bit about how it's been used. So you kind of get a sense of just the extraordinary value of census data to the Jewish community. So the all-important question, and for those of you who have already filled in your census form, this will look familiar. If you haven't, then this is what it looks like online. This is the all-important question. It asks, what's your religion? And a few things just to note about it, first of all. The first thing is just under where it says, what's your religion? It says this question is voluntary. The question is optional. It's one of 2 questions actually this time that is optional. The other one is about gender identity. And the reason why it's voluntary was because when the question was first introduced in 2001, It was considered to be sensitive, a little personal. So in a kind of, to fudge it in a way, they wanted to gather some data on religion, because Britain was becoming an increasingly multicultural society, but they didn't want to, cross any boundaries. So they gave people the option to answer it or not. So Jews essentially have three possibilities, really, when confronted with this question. One is to ignore it and just move on to the next question. The second is to tick the top box, which is to say, I have no religion, which you can do if you wish. And the third is to tick the Jewish box. There, you can see it. And my strong recommendation is for Jews to tick the Jewish box, and I'll hopefully explain why over the next few minutes. But before I go into that, let me just show you a little bit of what that question in 2001 and 2011 generated in the most simple terms. So the figures in blue are from 2001, the columns in orange are from 2011, and it shows us something very interesting about what's happening, or at least what happened between 2001 and 2011 in Britain. So if you look at the proportion of the population of England and Wales that was Christian, it dropped from 72% to 59%. The proportion that comes from other religions, that's all of them, Jews are in there somewhere, rose from 6 to 8%. The proportion of people who said they had no religion jumped from 15 to 25% over that 10-year period. And those that didn't answer it was about the same each time, around 7-8%. So I think there are just a few sort of interesting insights about Britain that you can see instantly from this data. One is that sort of traditional Christian Britain is in decline. The numbers of people who identify as Christian is in decline. Now it's around the 50% mark. It may even be below 50% that comes back in 2021. The second is that Britain's becoming more and more multicultural. You can see that in the other religions. They're not a big proportion, but it's growing. And the other thing you can see very clearly is this sort of the trend towards secularism, atheism, no religion, and all of those things. I think we have seen in happening in Britain over the course of the last decade or two in various different ways. If we focus in on the other religions, these are the numbers now. We're not looking at percentages, we're looking at numbers, but this is what happened between 2001 and 2011. So the Muslim population jumped from about 1.5 million to 2.7 million. The Hindu population rose from 550,000 or so to over 800,000. Sikh population grew from 329 to 423. The Buddhist population jumped from 144 to 248. People associating with other religions, not including Jewish, also rose from about 150 to 240,000. In fact, the only minority religion that basically remained stable was Jews. And the figures were around sort of 260, climbing very, very slightly to 263. Of course, that's not the total population, because we know that there's an option not to answer this question. But from other work we've done, we are pretty confident that we're picking up about 90% of the Jewish population. So there's about 10% of the Jewish population that doesn't tick the religion question. But I think for many people, that's kind of the assumption is that that's what the census generates, like how many Jews or how many Muslims or how many people live in a particular country. But the reason why it's interesting from a Jewish point of view is not simply the number of people that tick a box. But what we can do with census data is we can isolate all the people who tick Jewish and then look at how they answered all the other questions that are in the census. And just before I go through that, you can just see the numbers there. So in 2001, 215, just short of 260,000 ticked the box in England and Wales. Across the UK, it was 266,000. In 2011, it was 263,000 in England and Wales. Across the UK, 271,000, so including Scotland and Northern Ireland. So very similar figures, very, very slight increase. But as I said, the interesting thing where the census becomes interesting is when we isolate all those people who tick Jewish and look at how they answered the questions in the census. So geography, where do they live? How old are Jews? How healthy are they? What are their living standards? What are their socioeconomic circumstances? What do their household look like? Do they live exclusively with Jews? Do they live in mixed families? How large are their households? partnerships, who are they married to? How do they understand their ethnic identity? What countries were they born in? What's their educational achievement? What is their working status, etc.? So we get extraordinary information from it. And I just want to give you a few examples. I'm just going to focus on the top four, on geography, age, health, and living standards, because we don't have time to go through very much. But I thought I'd share some of the data that have come out between 2001 and 2011, so you get a sense of what we can learn from it. So let me move on to geographical data first of all. This is a big chart with a lot of information on it, but these are the largest 25 Jewish populations by local authority district, or borough, if you like, in 2011. And just to kind of give you a sense of, just to help you read the table, if you look at the top line is the borough of Barnet. That's where the largest Jewish population in England and Wales, in the UK, lives. The number in Barnet in 2011 was 54,000. In 2001, it was lower, it was 46,000. So it climbed by over 7,000. That's a 15.8% increase. But I think what's potentially quite interesting here is if you focus, first of all, on the places highlighted in green, so Hertsmere and St Albans, and look at the right-hand column, you can see that the growth, there's quite significant growth in both of those places by 33%, 40%. So we know from this that there's you know, we've got a clear idea of where the Jewish population is growing. If you look at the places highlighted in blue, some of them are in London, some outside. So we've got the borough of Harrow, Redbridge, Enfield, Brent outside of London. We've got Leeds, Brighton, Liverpool, Southend. And again, looking at the right-hand column, you can see that the Jewish populations in those places declined between 2001 and 2011, between about sort of 20 to 30%, depending on where we're looking. There's often this sense that Jews from the regions are leaving and declining and moving to London. What we actually see is there's some of that going on, but there are also parts of London where the Jewish population is declining in very, very similar ways to some of the regional communities. And then the last thing I think to kind of just flag up here is if you look at the places highlighted in yellow, particularly Hackney, parts of Haringey are important in this context, Salford in Manchester, Gateshead. Look at the figures on the right, and here we see like very significant growth of 44%, 48%. If you go to Gateshead, we're talking 92% growth. That's basically almost doubling in 10 years. And of course, these are all centers of the Haredi community where we see massive Jewish population growth going on. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So just looking at these data, and again, these are quite sort of basic data as far as the census is concerned, we get a sense of where the Jewish population is growing and declining. But let me focus in on Barnet because that's where Aelith is, and that's where I am as well at the moment. So it's interesting to see. The figures I showed you before were how many Jews live in the borough of Barnet. But one of the things that's extraordinary about census data, and this is because it's such a large data set, as I said, there are 263,000 Jews in this data set, is that we can really kind of drill down. So here we've divided Barnet up into wards. There are 21 wards in Barnet, and we can see exactly what the Jewish population is in each of those wards. So the darker the shade, the larger the Jewish population. The census allows us to go a level further. This is now called what's called super output area mid-level. Now Barnet's divided up into 41 areas. And again, we've got information about the Jewish population in each of them. We can go a level further. This is super output area lower level. Barnet's now divided up into 211 little areas. And again, we've got the population size in each of them. And you can actually go a lower level still. This is called output area. And now Barnet's divided up into 1,047 little tiny areas. Now we're down to kind of a handful of streets in each one. And we've got Jewish population data for every single one of these little areas. And you can see, I don't know if can you see my mouse? But Aelith is, this is the North Circular here. So Aelith, I guess, is just somewhere around here on the map. Don't know exactly, but somewhere around there. So you can see, the population at that level of granularity. Now, why is that interesting, or how is that helpful? Well, actually, before I get to that, this is we can we can pan out. So now we're looking at sort of the whole of London and the area to the northwest. So you can see Hertsmere, Bushey, Elstree, Boreham Wood. You can see Barnet. You can see this area in Hackney, which of course is centre of the Haredi community. You can see the Redbridge community leaking out into Epping Forest. So we get these sort of very detailed maps. And of course, with 2001 and 2011 data together, we can see where growth and decline is happening, in very intricate detail. So I said at the beginning, the Jewish population of the UK basically remained stable between 2001 and 2011. But when you look at it in this way, the areas shaded in red are a decline, and the darker the shade of red, the more the decline. And the areas shaded in blue are areas of growth, Jewish population growth, and the darker the shade, the more the growth. So you see this real patchwork picture of growth and decline in various different places, and so you really kind of get a sense of what's happening at a sort of detailed geographical level. Excuse me. And where these data I think become particularly useful is this is just an example of a piece of work that we did for Stanmore United Shul a few years ago. So here you can see we're sort of in Stanmore, Edgware, Burnt Oak, Belmont, Elstree. You can see the sort of the area we're looking at. You can see the M1 kind of running across the map towards the top. In the middle of the circles is Stanmore Shul, and you can use census data basically to figure out how many Jews live within half a mile and a half of the front door of, in this case, Stanmore Shul. And of course, it's not just numbers. Census data will give us an idea of the age profile of these populations, their economic circumstances, their health status, etc. So when it comes to sort of planning for local services and what the local Jewish community looks like, this sort of information is incredibly useful for shuls and indeed for schools when they're thinking about catchment areas and that sort of thing. So that's just an idea of some of the sort of geographical insights. Let me show you a little bit about age data. This is a population pyramid for the Jewish population of England and Wales in 2011. I don't know if people are familiar with population pyramids, so forgive me if I'm telling you things you already know, but very briefly, the bars in blue represent Jewish males, in orange represent Jewish females. You can see at the bottom of the chart, we're talking about the youngest, age 0 to 4, sort of babies and very young children. And as you go further and further up, you get older and older to the top bar where we're looking at 85+-year-olds. And essentially, the further the bars extend from the center, the larger that age group is in the population. So you can see there's a particularly sizable population, or a sort of extra large in the sort of among the youngest. And there's also, I think, importantly, an interesting sort of bulge in the 60 to 64-year-olds. Now, of course, this is from 2011, so we're talking about people who are now 70 to 74. Now, why is there that bulge? Because immediately after the Second World War, there was a baby boom in Britain generally, but also in the Jewish community. And that you see, you can see that baby boom very clearly in the age distribution data shown here. Now, the thing I love about population pyramids is you can look at them, you can just glance at them and they instantly tell you something about the nature of the nature of a population. So there are a number of kind of classic shapes, and you can see them there on the bottom left. If you look in that box at the shape on the top left-hand corner of that box, when you see that sort of shape, a very wide base, i.e. lots of babies and children, and a very small tip, very few elderly people, that's a population that, all things being equal, will grow over time because it's got a lot of children and very few elderly people. The one in the top right, similar sort of picture, it will just happen more slowly. Again, a broad base, fairly small top. The one in the bottom left, that sort of nice curved shape, upside down U, is basically an indication of a population that's going to stay stationary over time. And when you see that sort of curving in at the bottom, i.e. a drop in the birth rate, that's a sign that a population is likely to decline over time because there's a smaller number of children being born into it. So when we look at the overall population pyramid for England and Wales in 2011, I think it's probably closest to the sort of the stationary picture. There's a little bit of growth at the bottom, but broadly speaking, it follows that that is probably closest to that shape, and that explains why we're sort of seeing a fairly stationary picture in terms of the overall population size. But just a couple of other population pyramids to show you. This is the same population pyramid, but here we've taken out the Jewish populations of Hackney and Gateshead and Salford in Manchester, so places where we know there are large Haredi communities. And here you can kind of see that there is that kind of curving in at the bottom. So when we take Haredim out of the Jewish population, we're seeing a population that's showing signs of decline. By the way, included in this is the Jewish population of Barnet, which includes, you know, some Haredi families in Golders Green. So it kind of that growth at the bottom is partly driven by that. And when we look at the Haredi population, we're just focusing here on the Haredi populations of Hackney, Salford, Gateshead. This is the shape. So massive growth. And this is one of the most important things I think happening in the British Jewish community today. We're seeing very significant growth in the Haredi sector, and slow, but nevertheless, but it's happening. A decline in the size of the Jewish population elsewhere. Now, why is that data helpful? Well, this is a piece of work that we did for Jewish Care. And here we can use census data from 2011 to project forward and see how many Jews are likely to be living in Britain here we were projecting forward from 2011, in 2016, in 2021, and into 2026 and into the 2030s. And you can see, if you focus on the columns, and these are the figures on the right-hand side of the graph, that those columns are getting larger and larger. So, and this is focused on the Jewish population age 65 plus. So one of the things we're expecting to see is growth among that age group in the Jewish population over time. If you can kind of see that there are then sort of lines representing smaller age bands, 65 to 69, 70 to 74, 75 to 79. And you can see these sort of waves here and here and here. They kind of repeat itself every 5 years. And what are those waves? Those waves are the baby boomer generation, or the post-war baby generation. Like, we can see them kind of coming through. But the really important thing here, and the reason why we did this piece of work for Jewish Care, is the dotted line, the 85-plus-year-olds. Because, you know, one of the things we can see happening was between 2011 and 2016, there was a big decline in the numbers. And here we're looking at the numbers on the left. At the moment, we're in a very sort of stable phase. But as we move into the mid-2020s and into the 30s, we're going to see that population grow. So knowing that for an organization like Jewish Care is critical, because they are going to have to cater for increased demand over the course of that period. But it's temporary, because it's partly driven by that baby boomer factor. So again, that's just sort of one of the ways, I guess, that we can use these data to help community planning. These are data at the other end of the age spectrum. Again, in age in 2011, these are the numbers of children there are in each year group, basically, this allows us to kind of get a sense of of how many children there are in a particular cohort. So when it comes to thinking about school places, or trying to make sense of whether there's been an increase in numbers of Israel experience participants, like knowing the base, knowing how many children there are in a particular year group is really important to make sense of kind of whether an increase in participation is because people are thinking this is because the program's more popular, or simply because there are just more children in that year group. Let me quickly show you some health data. This is there are data from the census on numbers of Jews living in Britain with a limiting health condition. We get this sort of information, and we can look at it by age, whether people have, whether their health limits their life a little or a lot, and how many people in different age bands are in those groups. And we've used those data for actually a piece of work that we finished recently for Jewish Blind and Disabled. They're looking to build a new facility in this area, bushy Elstree. So knowing kind of what the numbers are, what the likely demand is for their sort of assisted living services, this is one of the valuable data sets that we can use in order to help them figure out whether there's demand and just to get a sense of the need. This is from a piece of work that we did for Langdon, which is a charity that supports people with learning disabilities, children and adults. And here we can use census data to kind of figure out how many people, how many Jews there are in different age bands in different parts of the country. And we actually did this. We separated out the mainstream population and the Haredi population by age, different levels of severity. We get a real clarity on, how many Jews are there in London aged 10 to 14 that have severe learning disabilities, right? We know that number is 22, more or less 22. Might be slightly higher, might be slightly low, but it's in that ballpark. Let me show you economic data. This is also, do this very briefly. The census doesn't ask about people's income, but it asks various questions that are sort of proxies for income. So one of which is, what kind of housing do you live in? If you live in rented accommodation, do you own your own house? If you do own it outright, are you paying a mortgage? And this is sort of interesting because you can break it down. I've just broken it down by borough here. But the blue shade is owned, either owned outright, dark blue, or owned with a mortgage in lighter blue. And then the orangey yellow gold color is rented, either social rented or private rented. And you see like real distinctions here in terms of the wealth profile of the Jewish population. So you can kind of look at Harrow and Hertsmere, and you see 90% of people own their own home, either with a mortgage or outright. The reason why Hertsmere is a little lower in terms of owning outright is it's a younger population. So there are just more people there that haven't yet paid off their mortgage. But you compare that with the Haredi population in Hackney, and you can see it's, there's over 70% there who are living in rented accommodation, rented housing, and most of them in private rented housing. But also differences between Hackney and Salford and Gateshead. Those are all Haredi populations. But once you go outside of London, they're very similar socioeconomic profile, but more can afford property. So you kind of see those sorts of distinctions. One of the ways that kind of housing data have been used and economic data is this is a kind of a particularly interesting project that we're doing at the moment for a little known housing association called the Industrial Dwelling Society. People might have heard of it or not, but they're doing work at the moment to try to build low cost housing for low income Jewish families who can't afford to live in Jewish areas like the one shown on this map, but want to do so. So they're working on a project to try and build 500 new housing units in Jewish neighborhoods for low income families. And this is one of the maps that we've generated using census data, superimposing on it data from where different Jewish services and organizations and schools and shuls are, in order to support housing planning applications for them. So again, using census data for those sorts of purposes, and there is no other source that allows us to do this sort of thing. The last thing I just wanted to say about sort of the value of census data is for weighting purposes. So these are kind of a number of reports that we've written at JPR over the last few years that have been where we've used census data. So whether it's surveys of attitudes to Israel, or a couple of research projects that we've done for the European Union on Jewish people's experiences and perceptions of anti-Semitism across Europe. The data on the UK, we've used census data there. The big National Jewish Community Survey that we did in 2013 that we'll be repeating probably early next year, which was a kind of a generic survey that looked at lots of different issues. We've done work at the bottom left on trying to figure out what educational interventions have the biggest impact on Jewish people's identities. We've done work on charitable giving, patterns of charitable giving. We've done a lot of work recently on COVID and the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic. And in all of those cases, even though there's little reference to the census in any of those reports, we're using census data for weighting purposes, because when we gather a sample for a research project, it's the census we turn to assess whether the sample we've got is representative or not, and it's the census we use to weight it or adjust it so that to make it as representative as possible. So in pretty well every single survey that's been done of British Jews, certainly for the last 10 years or so, census data are sit in the background and are being used in order to help us generate those sorts of figures accurately. Like since the 2011 census, there have been 30 different reports we've written covering lots of different themes: health, education, employment, elderly care, poverty, charitable giving, Israel, anti-Semitism. We've done 36 commissioned studies now for different Jewish organizations and charities and foundations to help them plan for the future. We use the data all the time in presentations to community leaders to help them to see and understand the trends that are going on. And we get, hundreds of questions, just inquiries about Jewish demography from community leaders or rabbis or professionals or journalists or academics. And more often than not, we're turning to census data to help answer those sorts of questions. And all of that work is basically dependent upon people ticking that box, because by ticking it, you help to create a data set that allows us to do that sort of work and feeds into community planning in all of those sorts of ways. So if you haven't yet completed your form, or even if you have, you can still go back into it and amend it. I'd really encourage people to tick the box, because that's the real, from my perspective anyway, as a social scientist, that's the real value of doing so. It just creates this extraordinary data set that allows us to really understand the community and help organizations plan for our shared future. If you want to see any of the reports I've mentioned or see some of the stuff we've generated, you can see our website address there at the bottom. It's jpr.org.uk. So everything is freely available, and so feel free to have a look, have a play, and I'll stop there. There's probably plenty more to say, and I'm sure there are plenty of questions that people have or plenty of issues that people want to raise, but I guess that's at least my starter for 10, if you like.
John, thank you. Almost all of the questions that I've received so far are about the other question on the census that we might choose to answer, which is the ethnicity question, and how it comes to how it's decided what counts as an ethnicity, how we should respond to it, what happens if you feel ethnically Jewish but not religiously Jewish, and what's kind of what we can see in terms of people ticking those boxes. So do you want to speak a little bit about that, the ethnicity question as well? Sure.
I'll tell you what, I was prepared for this one, so I'll share my screen again, so we all know what we're talking about. Hold on 1 second. Let me scroll down to the right bit. Okay, here we go. Oops, that didn't work. Sorry, let's try that again. Is that going to work? There we go. Okay, hopefully people can see that. So the other question that often gets talked about is the ethnicity one. And the ethnicity question was introduced in the 1991 census, so before the religion question was. For very similar reasons, by the way. Britain was becoming more and more multicultural. It was an opportunity to gather data about it. And there are basically 5 options in the ethnicity question. You can either say you're white, or you are mixed, or you are Asian, or you are black, or you can say other. And what happens in the census, by the way, is when you tick whichever of those you tick, it takes you to a follow-up question. So you might tick white, and then it will say, okay, well, are you white British or white Irish or white Gypsy or white Roma or anything else or other? And if you want to say other, you can write something in at that point. And the same with, mixed or Asian or black, or you can go to other as well. When you click on other, it takes you to this, which is, are you Arab or are you any other ethnic group? If you click on any other ethnic group, again, you can write in whatever you like there. So that's essentially the question. Just to show you what happened in 2011, what people did as a way of perhaps getting a sense. So of the 263,000 Jews who identified as Jewish by religion, this is how they answered the ethnicity question. So the vast majority said they were white, some version of white, 92%. There's 1.6% who said they were mixed. In most cases, those people are people who understand their ethnicity as sort of mixed Ashkenazi Sephardi in some way, or Mizrahi or something along those lines. There's about 1% who say they're Asian British. There's just over 0.5% who say black in some way, and then there were about 11,000 who said other. When we put all of this together, in 2011, there were 33,000 people who wrote in Jewish somewhere, in some way, shape or form, either under other or under white Jewish or mixed Jewish or whatever. Now, the interesting thing is, in 2011 anyway, of those 33,000, 25,000 also said they were Jewish by religion. So what happened with the ethnicity question is it added about 8,000 to the total. So when we're trying to figure out the Jewish population as a whole, then we obviously take into consideration those 8,000 extra 8,000 who have identified as Jewish. But the complication from I'll stop sharing because that's basically all I have to say about that. But the complication, I think, from a sort of data analysis perspective is that it's quite difficult to get data out of the Office for National Statistics from the religion question and the ethnicity question together. So typically the data I've shared with you are based on the religion question. And as I said, because about 90% of the Jewish population tick the religion question, that's a very, very helpful data set for planning because it's so large. But we use the ethnicity data wherever we can. And one of the conversations that we are involved in with the Office for National Statistics this time round is to encourage them to create what's called a derived variable that would draw on data both from the religion question and the ethnicity question, so that we have the broadest possible number of Jews included in the kind of analysis that I've shared. Now, in terms of what is the right way to answer the ethnicity question, there isn't, from my perspective, there isn't a right way. I think the most important thing, I mean, from a Jewish communal perspective, I think there's real value in ticking the Jewish box in the religion question. In terms of the ethnicity question, because there isn't a Jewish box, it matters far less what people do there from a planning point of view. I know it's been a big issue recently, but my recommendation is for people to do whatever feels right. It's not a great question. It's not an easy question, I think, not just for Jews to answer, but for lots of people to answer, because it's not entirely obvious necessarily where they fit in. But I would just say answer it as you wish. Answer it as makes sense to you, which is different from my recommendation on the religion question, where, as I said, ticking the Jewish box is because it's the only box in the census that has the word Jewish associated with it. That's what makes it really, really valuable.
And is there this is one of those sort of finger in the air kind of questions. Do you think there's a kind of hidden Jewish population who the census, because Jewish isn't there as a box in the ethnicity question, and because they understand themselves as not being religiously Jewish, do you think there's kind of a hidden Jewish population who we don't see coming out through the census?
There's a small hidden population. So as I said, we know from other methods that the Jewish population of this country is about 300,000, probably slightly under. So, and we know that we picked up about 271,000 plus an additional, 8,000 from the ethnicity question. So we're picking up about 280,000 altogether. So there's a hidden 20,000 or so, which is a relatively small proportion, but hidden nonetheless. There's when we've other research that's been done on Jewish population figures, the question always is who is a Jew? Who are you counting in, right? So that 300,000 figure is basically based on research that is research that identifies self-identifying Jews, people who, when asked either in a census or in a survey, are you Jewish or what religion are you, they will identify as Jewish. But then there are other sort of types of Jewishness. So you could ask, okay, what's the size of the Jewish population that has Jewish parents, right? So that's larger. That's like 330,000. You could ask, what's the size of the Jewish population if you include everyone who lives in a household with Jews? So that might be like non-Jewish partners or non-self-identifying Jewish children. And once you start thinking about that population, it increases again. And you can go further still. So if we use, for example, the law of return definition, which is the Israeli law of return, is who's entitled to Israeli citizenship under Israeli law, and it's basically anybody who has a Jewish grandparent, a single Jewish grandparent, or who lives with somebody who has a single Jewish grandparent, right? And if we're talking about that population, it's about 420,000. So when we say hidden, the question is, what's the definition that we're talking about? The reason why I think the religion question is such a valuable, but one of the reasons why I think it is because most of the people there are self-identifying Jews, people who, as I said, when asked if they're Jewish, will say yes. Therefore, it's that population that's most likely to want to use Jewish services, right? Want to at some point join a shul or be, even simply just be buried in a Jewish cemetery or whatever it is. So in terms of community planning, that's the most valuable population to think about.
So something like the ethnicity question, how much influence does an organization like JPR or equivalent organizations have on the nature of the census question? Who chooses what the questions are? So, do you get any input into, as you're having that conversation about kind of, how you get the data out, do you also get input into how you get the data in?
Yeah, so as I said, in England and Wales, it's run by the Office of National Statistics. We have quite close collegial relationships with various statisticians there. So there's a sort of an ongoing relationship. We sort of collaborate on projects sometimes, or input into their work, and they sometimes input into ours. But more formally, they run consultations. So when preparing the census, they invited us and other Jewish organisations, particularly the Board of Deputies, to submit their thoughts on issues around inclusion or around around the interest of the community. And actually, before 2001, before the introduction of the religion question, our recommendation, this is before my time, so these are my predecessors, but our recommendation, along with the Board of Deputies, was that Jewish should have been included both in the religion question and the ethnicity question, because of course, we know Jews are, self-identify as Jewish by religion and by ethnicity, and some clearly prefer one over the other. So that was the recommendation. For whatever reason, the Office of National Statistics didn't go down that path. That wasn't considered the right thing to do at that point. They replicated the same approach in 2011 before this census. So we're going back a few years now, 2017, 2018 maybe. they ran consultations again on this. And we were we were faced with an interesting challenge, actually, about whether to go back to the original recommendation or to stick with the existing one. And we actually, in the end, after much deliberation, decided it was probably best to stick with the original position, because, again, from the community planning point of view, to change anything in a census, to change the way in which Jews identify, would affect our ability to compare one data set with the next. So what would happen if you included a Jewish tick box in the ethnicity question is, yes, we would probably pick up more Jews through that process, but it would also have an adverse effect on the religion question. So fewer Jews would tick that box. And that then kind of introduces all sorts of questions about, how comparable are the data that would come out of 2021 with 2011 and 2001. So, in our judgment, that was a more important thing to focus on than on the specifics of how Jews would choose to identify. Well, I don't know whether that was right or wrong. I mean, it's a slightly controversial position to take, but I think from a communal planning perspective, it was the right one. But right now there's another consultation going on now about it, about whether there should be a Jewish tick box in the ethnicity question. One of the things, sorry to go on about this, but it's but one of the things that's really interesting is that the question has been tested. Part of the work that the Office of National Statistics did prior to 2021 was they ran a series of focus groups with Jews, where they presented them with, the religion question with the Jewish tick box and the ethnicity question with a Jewish tick box, just to kind of get a sense of how Jews felt about it. And this was part of the reason why we made the recommendation we made. Was what they found was that Jews really, really don't like the ethnicity question with the Jewish tick box. Number one, it doesn't really make sense to most Jews. It's maybe the easiest way to sort of explain it is it felt like in that research to most Jews a bit like a question where the answers were kind of blue, red, yellow, green, and banana, right? With Jews being banana, right? It just sort of felt like this. It's incongruous, right? Am I black, white, Asian, mixed, or Jewish? Like it just felt. Many Jews sort of experienced that as sort of incongruous. And the other kind of key critique that came out of that piece of research was many Jews found it discriminatory. They couldn't understand why Jews were being isolated or separated out there, whereas in the religion question, it makes sense. Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, like we understand ourselves as fitting into that category. So part of the reason why they took the decision they took was because when they tested it, it actually didn't work very well with Jews.
So moving away from the ethnicity questions,
yes.
What are you excited to see coming out of this census? What are there particular trends you're interested in, either from a kind of policy perspective or just in terms of kind of what you're excited to see happening in the Jewish community?
Fundamentally, what I'm excited to see are the data, because for us to have 3 data sets separated out over a 20-year period of this quality, of this detail, will be useful in all sorts of ways. One of the areas where it's particularly helpful is one of the weakness of the census is that it only happens every 10 years. So we don't actually have great data on children under 10 at the moment, right? So when the census data come out, we should get a whole load of new information about the youngest groups. So in terms of school planning, particularly at primary level, the census data are going to be really, really helpful on that front. So I think there's certainly stuff I think to understand there. There's this whole issue of kind of Haredi growth and kind of mainstream Jewish population decline. We've got 2 data points. Having a third data point I think will help us to understand much more about that. Geographical shifts. there's the assumptions that that the Jewish populations of different communities are declining or growing. Again, we've got really good data at 2 points in time. Having a third point gives us a much better and more up to date and richer insight into kind of how the types of geographical shifts that are taking place. So but it's really kind of a little bit of everything. It's there's nothing particularly specific. What the way we tend to work is whatever questions come up, whatever challenges that the community is facing, or issues that different organisations want to explore, we'll typically dip into the census data set and see what we can draw out of it. So it's really a bit of everything.
So you mentioned it happening every 10 years and the limitations of that. So one of the things that's been going around over the last few weeks has been this suggestion that post the pandemic, there should be an additional census in 2026. So therefore 26 and 31. What's the case that's going on there? What's the concern as a social scientist? What are people worrying about that should be the case?
So the concern is the pandemic, basically. This is a massive data gathering exercise. It's key for planning, and the big question is, will the pandemic basically distort what normal life looks like? Now, from a historical perspective, I think it will be one of the most interesting censuses that there's ever been, because for a census to happen under these circumstances, I think will be really interesting. But it does affect kind of the value of the data in some way, because people may be living in households that they wouldn't normally live in. They may be have a different working status than they would normally, and the Office of National Statistics has sort of tried to kind of get around some of that sort of stuff by asking people both what their normal working status is, but also asking what their current working status is, but asking them questions about what their job is and what kind of role they have to as a way sort of around that a little bit. But it's but yeah, so there's thinking that if having run the exercise and discovered that it was less useful than people hoped, there might be cause for a sort of a 2026 repeat. Although I'd be surprised, because it's incredibly expensive to run. But the other big question that's going on here around the census, and it's one that's that's going on around with censuses around the world actually, is whether there's a cheaper way to do this. Like, kind of the research world is changing. There are all sorts of new data sets being generated. So one of the pieces of work that's being planned for 2023 is to look at various different data sets, see if they can be pulled together, and see if by pulling together data sets on health and education and and employment from surveys and other sources, you can effectively replicate what you get from a census. So there's also work going on in that regard, because if it is possible to do that, which I think is unlikely, by the way, but if it is possible, that would be that would be a huge cost-saving exercise.
Is this the first census online, primarily online? Was 2011? This is the first one.
It's the first one sort of really primarily online.
Right.
I mean, you could complete 2011 online as well, although most people didn't. This one, there's been a much bigger attempt to do so. In fact, online is the fundamental way. 2011, right. The basic way was on paper, but you could if you wanted to. Right. But internet access rates have kind of have gone up significantly over the last 10 years, so it was considered possible to do so. And actually, I think they've done a phenomenal job. Actually, it's a very sort of user-friendly interface, and quite interesting to fill out as well, I think.
Right. And so I suppose that kind of relates a little bit to another question, which is around whether there are groups that are sort of that have particular census hesitancy or resistance. And in particular, kind of within the Jewish world, there is a section of the Jewish world which is not online in the same way that our bit of Northwest London is, and which also doesn't necessarily have English as its first language. So is there a particular challenge around how you access the Haredi community for census data, particularly now that there are new methods of filling it in, essentially?
The Haredi community is more online than people think. First of all, a lot of Haredim have smartphones, even if they don't have internet access at home. That's I think that's one of the factors. But look, in 2001, Haredim definitely were undercounted, and that's partly because no one really thought about it seriously beforehand. Having realised what happened in 2001, there were much greater efforts both within the Haredi community and from the Office of National Statistics to encourage people from the Haredi community to respond. And this time around, there are even more efforts going on. You can complete the census in lots of different languages, including Yiddish, including Hebrew. And so that's available. There's like one of the issues with the Haredi population when the form was on paper was there's only space there for 6 people in a household, like two parents and 4 children, basically. So if you're talking about larger households with 5, 6, 7 plus children, the average number of children per Haredi woman in this country is between 6 and 7. If you're filling out a form on paper, you have to request a continuation form for person 7, 8, 9, 10, etc. in the household. So one of the things that's happened with Haredi data is that children have been under enumerated because people weren't asking for continuation forms. This time round, the ONS is kind of on top of that. It's making continuation. Well, first of all, it's encouraging people to complete it online, so you can answer for as many people as you like within the household online. But secondly, there's a lot of work going on the ground, handing out continuation forms, knocking on doors, helping people out, that sort of stuff. So I think we've all learned something over the course of the last 2 censuses about what needs to be done to help support not just the Haredi community, but there are lots of kind of minority communities, non-English speaking communities that are not even necessarily aware that a census is going on, or that they have to or that they're required to complete it. So there's a lot of work along those sorts of lines that's going on around it.
And I suppose may also be hesitant in sharing data with government, which I suppose is also a Jewish question in terms of kind of, censuses generally. So who actually has access to non-anonymized data? How does that work with the nature of the data when I put it in, who gets to know about me, and do they know it's about me? I suppose is the question.
Right. So no one. It's really very, very strictly anonymous, and the only people who have access to the data are the Office of National Statistics, which is an independent organisation, independent of government. And actually, if any personal data were to get out, the head honchos at the Office of National Statistics are in serious trouble. I mean, it's kind of an imprisonable offence, basically. So census data are widely available, but in an anonymized, aggregated form. So they, you can. There's a website called NOMIS, NOMIS. You can go and access census data quite easily. It will generate all sorts of data tables for you. You have to kind of play with it. It takes a little bit of work to kind of figure out how it works. It's not the most user-friendly interface, but you can certainly have a poke around. But you're not going to find out any personal information about anybody. It's and actually we were talking about this earlier, Josh. The census data, census records, personal census records are not released for 100 years. So at some point in the not too distant future, census data from 1921, census records from 1921 will start to be available. So you can look up, your your grandparents or your great grandparents if they were living in England at the time, and find out all sorts of interesting information about them. But it takes 100 years for that that sort of information to come out. At this stage, it's anonymized, aggregated data, and that's that's for sort of very obvious reasons. So probably of all research organizations in the country, probably indeed even in the world, the one I trust most with my data is the Office of National Statistics. It's the laws around census data in particular are incredibly tight. There are no risks here really.
I could carry on for a little while longer, but we have reached our 8 o'clock. So all that's left for me to do is to say thank you, Jonathan, for being with us, for sharing an hour of your time. To encourage everyone, I suppose, to tick the box in the religion question and to fill in the ethnicity question however you feel fit, however you want. I also just want to encourage everyone to go to the JPR website. There's a lot there that certainly we have used as a community over the years, but also that's just really fascinating to look at. Jonathan is too polite to do this himself, but also to point out that there's a little button in the bottom right-hand corner where it says donate, which reflects the fact that JPR is a charitable organisation, and so if you are inspired by it, you could also show that you are inspired by supporting it in a different way as well. Thank you once again, Jonathan. Wishing everyone a good evening, and hopefully we'll see everyone over Shabbat. And Jonathan, thank you again.
Thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach.